Y'all can have a seat. So, thanks guys. It's fun playing with you tonight. Like I said earlier, last week we started our series on the giants of church history by talking about Martin Luther. And we did that because last week was the closest Sunday to the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. So as of today, the Reformation is officially over 500 years old, which is cool. Fun little history tidbit. But Martin Luther is the father of the Protestant Reformation, which was the moment that Western churches sort of began to break away from the Catholic Church because of doctrine, particularly doctrine of salvation through grace, which was Luther's kind of realization from reading Romans chapter 1. We talked about that last week, and how that radically changed the history of Europe and the world. And so, real quick, as I get back into it, I just want to very quickly, again, say that the reason we study church history is not just to learn a bunch of facts about people from the past, although if you're a history buff like me, that's fun enough. But the life of Martin Luther and the life of other people has lessons for us about our faith. The way that we live and the way that we think about our faith. And so studying these great figures from the past reminds us that we're part of a living and breathing faith, something that's been around for 2,000 years. And as I've said before, it's these people who faced the questions that we've already, that we're asking ourselves. They've asked them those questions before, facing some of the same issues that we face today. Their lives are often very similar to ours in ways that we might not expect. And so these revered people from the past can show us good, bad, and in-between ways that we can handle some of our own problems and understand our own faith. So, nobody embodies this idea of learning from the past more than St. Augustine, who we're going to look at tonight. And we're going to turn our clock back over 1,000 years. St. Augustine was born in 354 AD, so like almost 1,700 years ago. But before we begin looking at Augustine's life, just a quick word for all of us, something to be thinking about as we start the sermon, and that is, it's easy to assume that somebody who lived that long ago, 1,700 years ago almost, would have a life that's really, really different from ours. Because there's been 2 millennia almost of technological advancements and societal ideas and political revolutions, all the kind of stuff, right? The world looks really different than it did when Augustine was born. I mean, he was born before the fall of the Roman Empire. Rome was still a thing. It was a political entity back then. And so we have this sort of idea that like that person's life couldn't possibly be anything like our life today. And usually, when we think about it, it tends to be their life was much simpler. There was a lot less issues and problems, or at least the issues they faced were simpler issues. And in some senses, that's true. Life has gotten a bit more complex. But in many ways, life is much the same, and the problems that they faced are much the same. And the first time that I read Augustine's Confessions, the thing that struck me the most when I read it was how much it sounded like it could have been written yesterday. There are parts of it that don't apply to today. We currently don't have a lot of people who learn to study rhetoric. It's not like a hot topic. But the general ideas of his life, the movements of his life, the way that he lived and the problems that he faced struck me as like, oh my gosh, Augustine's life sounds a lot like a modern life. And so that struck me the first time I read the Confessions, and I hope that you will keep that in mind, that when we're talking about somebody as far back as Augustine, it doesn't mean that his life has nothing to say to us. It doesn't mean that his life is completely different from ours. And I hope you'll keep your ears open for the ways in which, like, oh my gosh, that sounds a lot like what happens today to people. So that we're not sort of, it's a recency bias, right? Or ageism, if you will. We think that, what's modern is more real or more complex, when the truth is history and people have always been complex and have always had lots of problems to deal with. Things haven't gotten more complex, and they weren't simpler back then. Life is life. So, with that said, St. Augustine was born in 354 AD in a small city in North Africa, right on the Mediterranean. His father was a very minor Roman official. Again, the Roman Empire was still around, and his father followed the old Roman pagan religions. But his mother, his name is Monica, was a devout Christian who prayed constantly for her husband and for her son to become Christians. Monica is a really, really important figure in Augustine's life. She's going to come up again. Augustine's mother and father, very quickly, as he's growing up, realized that he was super smart and incredibly gifted at speaking and at learning. So they spent most of their money on sending him to school. Back then, it wasn't just sort of assumed that you would go to school. If you had money to afford sending your son or a daughter, probably your son, to a teacher, that's how you would do it. You wouldn't send them to, we think of like elementary school, and you would send it to study with a tutor. And the tutor would have a classroom. Maybe there'd be more than one person, so it wasn't private tutoring. But you would have to spend your money, and if you didn't pay, your child didn't learn. So you had to have enough money in order for your children to learn. And fortunately for Augustine, his dad, being a Roman official, made enough money that he could afford school. So he's sent off to school, but at age 16, the money runs out. His parents can no longer afford to pay for his schooling anymore, so he returns home to Tagaste, which is the name of the city that he grew up in, and he basically starts to just spend his time wandering the streets with his friends, because he's not in school, there's no learning, and he probably wasn't learning his dad's trade. Again, Roman official, you can't really tag along to work day. There's important things going on. So during the break from education, he's basically just wandering the streets. And he begins to fall into a lot of behavior that he's later going to regret. He begins to boast to his friends about his sexual exploits, or just his made-up ones. He talks in confessions about how he would make up sexual exploits to impress his friends. And he also, there's kind of a big moment that happens where he and some friends steal some fruit from a neighbor's garden. And that's going to become an important moment for Augustine looking back, because he and his friends stole that fruit, not because they were hungry, not because they needed fruit. They didn't have any use for it. They were going to just feed it to pigs. They stole it just for the desire to steal something. And that's something that Augustine's going to return to. So I'll hopefully come back to that later. But Augustine's basically acting like a 16-year-old. He's a teenager, and he's out doing stupid teenager things, getting into trouble. Fortunately for him, thanks to a benefactor of some kind, we're really not sure who he was and why, at age 17, so only a year later, Augustine is able to go back to school at the city of Carthage, which was kind of the biggest city in North Africa at the time. And there he starts to study rhetoric, which is basically just learning how to read, write, and speak really well. And also how to be like a convincing debater, a convincing argumentalist. Make your speeches and your arguments really powerful. So while studying rhetoric, something that Augustine begins to realize is that all of the great speakers and debaters of the past were not just rhetoricians. They weren't just studying rhetoric. They were also philosophers, which meant that they not only spoke well, but they sought out truth, and they thought deeply about what truth is. So, in imitation of his heroes, Cicero and Cato, who are these great rhetoricians from the past, Augustine begins to turn to philosophy and religion. He's trying to discover what truth is. And even though he was raised a Christian by his mother, he didn't find the truth he was looking for in Christian faith as a child. And so his search leads him all over the place, different philosophies, different religions. Eventually, he latches on to what was known then as Manichaeism, which was a prominent religion at the time. And I don't need to go into all the details about Manichaeism. That's a lot of details you probably don't need. But the big important thing to know about Manichaeism is that they believed that the spirit was good, the body was bad, and also they believed that they were a purely rational religion. They were based on reason. Religions like Christianity were based on hokey old books and all that kind of stuff. And for Augustine, who's a studier, who's a thinker, it resonates with him. And so he's an amateur philosopher, and he gets drawn to Manichaeism as this rational philosophical religion. And also, he's a rhetorician, and he reads the Bible and says, man, this stuff it's not well written, it's not well argued, right? So he reads it, and he doesn't like what he reads. And so he goes away from Christianity, from the religion of his mother, and he turns to Manichaeism. And while he's in Manichaeism, right, he's searching for truth, but at the same time, he's still living that less than perfect sinful life. His mother, Monica, has continued to pray for him, but he's consistently turning a deaf ear to Monica. He's not listening. And during his studies at Carthage, he takes up with a woman, and he has a child out of wedlock, which is not a huge deal these days in our culture, but back then, even outside the Christian world, was a big deal to have a child out of wedlock. He continued to revel in all of his sin and sexual exploits and all of that, gambling and drinking. And one of my favorite lines from Augustine in the Confessions, he writes down one of his prayers at this time, as he's living this way and he's in Manichaeism, but he's sort of got this, recollection of the God of his mother, and it never really goes away for him. But one of the prayers that he used to pray all the time in this period of his life was, Lord, give me chastity, give me purity, but not yet. That was the prayer. He knew that what he was doing wasn't right, and that his mother's prayers reminded him that God was there, but he wasn't ready to give up the pleasures of the world just yet. So after completing his studies, Augustine becomes a teacher of rhetoric. And he starts in Carthage, he moves to Rome, and then his students in both of those cities are really rowdy, and they're not paying him, so he's got to move on. And he winds up in the Italian city of Milan, which is in northern Italy, and they needed a teacher of rhetoric, so he knows he can get students there. Anyway, in Milan is a man who's going to change Augustine's life, and that's the Bishop Ambrose. And Ambrose is a hugely fascinating figure. I could have done a whole one of these sermons on just him, too. He's another one of those giants of the faith. But his role in Augustine's life is what I want to focus on tonight. Augustine has been growing tired of Manichaeism. He's quickly discovering that their so-called rationality is not all that it seems to be. He has some questions for them that the Manichaeans can't answer. And then they're like, oh, well, there's this guy. I forget the guy's name right now. He's like our great thinker. When he comes into town, you ask him your questions, he'll have all the answers. This guy rolls into town, and he's an idiot. He can't answer any of Augustine's questions. And so he's fed up. He's done with Manichaeism. And he goes to hear Ambrose speak, not because he's drawn back to Christianity, but because Ambrose is considered one of the great speakers of his day. He's a preacher, and again, preaching requires speech. It's what rhetoricians did. So as a student of rhetoric, Augustine convinces himself to go hear Ambrose speak, who's supposedly really good at speaking. And so while listening to Ambrose speak, Ambrose's messages begin to chip away at the issues that Augustine has had with the faith, with Christianity. A lot of his issues with sort of the irrationality of Scripture, with the poorly writtenness of Scripture, all those things that were keeping him from the faith, Ambrose, in his sermons and in dialogue that Augustine starts meeting him with privately, and he starts to answer all of those questions. But despite all of that, despite the fact that he starts to feel himself drawn to Christianity and he's getting all of his questions answered, he's still not ready. He's still not ready to give up the life of sin that he's got. He's not ready to... Augustine knows that if he becomes a Christian, it's going to change his life. He's got to give up his career as a rhetoric teacher, which seems weird to us, but back then, if you were teaching rhetoric, what you were teaching was the classics, right? You're teaching lots of pagan, religious literature, kind of the Greek and Roman gods and mythology and all that stuff. And at the time, it was a lot less common for those things to be mixed. And so as a Christian, he knew he was going to have to give up the rhetoric career, the teaching career. He was going to have to give up his sinful lifestyle. And so this prayer, again, the give me chastity but not yet, has still got a strong hold on his life, even though his questions about Christianity are being answered. And so at that point, Augustine is starting to wrestle within himself constantly. He knows what he should do. He knows that he ought to become a Christian. He knows that he ought to devote himself to God, but he can't bring himself to do it. And then he starts hearing news of Christian conversions all around him that are just putting him to shame. A famous Roman philosopher becomes a Christian in Rome. 2 Roman officials, like his dad, get baptized and leave their jobs in the Roman government and devote themselves to monastic life. And so these people are doing the thing that Augustine can't bring himself to do. And they're in his career and they're in his lifestyle. And all of a sudden they become Christians, they leave. And he still can't bring himself to do it. And so he's facing this shame and it's driving him crazy. He can't stand to be around his family and his friends. It's eating him up inside. And at that moment, Augustine retreats to a garden. He goes to a garden in Milan, and he's just in complete despair, and he cries out to God. This is his words from the Confessions. "How long, Lord? How long? Will it be tomorrow and always tomorrow? Why does my uncleanliness not end this very moment?" Augustine was tormented by his sinfulness and his sinful desires. And then, from over the garden wall, he hears the voice of a child singing a nursery rhyme. "Take up and read, take up and read, take up and read." No idea what the song was about. We obviously don't know how the song went. Some not Christian song, just a child singing a song, "Take up and read." And in that moment, Augustine picks up a Bible that he's got with him, and he opens it to a random page, which is like, again, it's one of those things that you maybe have heard people doing, right? They just open the Bible to a random page, and how often does that work? You get something from Judges, and it's not going to help you out, right? But Augustine opens it up to Romans 13, which says, "Let us behave decently, as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh." And in that moment, this verse that spoke into the life that he'd been living for all these years, Augustine made the decision that he'd put off, and he gave himself to Christ. He went to his mother, who was overjoyed that her prayers have been answered, and he takes the necessary steps to be baptized. He gets baptized by Ambrose in Milan, along with his illegitimate son and some of his friends. And then Augustine takes his family, his mother and his son and his friends, and they go back to North Africa, and they start a monastery. And Augustine just intends to live out the rest of his life as a monk in seclusion, just with his close family and friends, and worshiping God. But God has other plans for Augustine. God's not going to let those talents go to waste, the rhetoric, the philosophical skills that he'd been given. In the first years as a monk, he starts to write some things, and through those writings, through his connection to Ambrose, Augustine becomes kind of a famous name in some Christian circles. Like, people have heard about this guy who Ambrose helped convert, and whose writing is so good because he was a rhetoric teacher for so long. And there's a city in North Africa, or there was, called Hippo, which is right near where he kind of founded his monastery. And one day, Augustine goes to church at the church there in Hippo, and the bishop of Hippo sort of gets a revelation from God that he should make Augustine his co-bishop. And so against Augustine's will, he's just sort of called up to the front, and everybody says, "Yeah, you're the bishop now." And he didn't want to do that. And soon, within a few years, that first bishop of Hippo is gone, and Augustine becomes the sole bishop. And that means he's got a bunch of responsibilities, right? He can't just live in monastic seclusion. He can't just be by himself worshiping God. He's got these responsibilities, and he's also got to write. He's writing all the time. But those writings have now become sort of the foundation of Christian theology and thought in the Western world for the last 1,500 years. I have this longer paragraph-ish on sort of the theology of Augustine. I'm just going to skip it. I could probably talk for a long, long time about Augustine's theology, about the various ideas that are sort of central to our faith that he helped to explain and understand. Again, he didn't come up with things that weren't in the Bible, but he helped us to understand what was there, and he sort of wrote it down in a way that's been super influential over the years. If you want to talk about Augustine's theology, guess what? We've got Theology on Tap on Thursday night, and I'll be happy to bring my Augustine here. I just want to show you. So I showed you guys the Confessions already. This is the autobiography. You should read this. This is City of God. Look at this thick old thing. I read this so you don't have to. No, I'm kidding. I actually really enjoyed reading this. But this is the kind of stuff that you go through for Augustine. He writes, 1,000-page books on various things. So I won't touch that tonight. But we can talk about that on Thursday if you want to. Point being, Augustine's theology, his writings, are incredibly influential to the Western world. He's probably the most influential writer since Paul, right? the Apostle Paul, who wrote half the New Testament. Besides the Bible, his books are the most quoted words of the Middle Ages. People in the church and outside of the church quoted Augustine more often than they quoted anybody else. He's the favorite theologian of the reformers, like the guys we talked about last week, right? Luther and Calvin and others. The Confessions, the biography that I've been drawing from for all of this, is like the greatest Christian autobiography in history. If you don't have it, pick up a good copy of that because it's really good and it's really important. And again, City of God, which is the other super thick thing I showed you. So anyway, he set Christian thought in sort of on its trajectory and its direction from his time up to the present day. But beyond all of that, beyond the really influential writing, his life is one that demonstrates sort of the incredible power of God. Because he spent his whole youth and early adulthood running from God. And yet he wound up becoming the most gigantic of the giants of church history. His life is a reminder that it's never too late to give yourself to God. No matter what you've done, God is waiting for you to turn to him. And he's supplying you with his grace and his love so that you can turn to him. Whatever your life has been, God can take that and make it something amazing, just like Augustine. And so, as I close the sermon tonight, on the screen we're going to put up these words, which, Kyle, I don't know if you can get that up there. What's coming up is the prayer that Augustine prayed after he read those words from Romans, when he's in that garden. At least as he's written it down in the Confessions, this is his prayer. And so what I'd like for us to do is, I would like for us to read it together, if you guys are okay with that. That's why it's on the screen. It's a beautiful prayer. You can consider it a prayer of confession, a prayer of turning back to God if you feel like there's some places or some ways in which you've turned from him, or just a prayer about the beauty of God's grace and how he's always there for us and with us. And then we're going to sing a song that's sort of based on these words, and then after that we're going to have some communion with Pastor Allen. So, would you read with me? Too late have I loved you, O beauty so ancient, O beauty so new. Too late have I loved you. You were within me, but I was outside myself, and there I sought you. In my weakness, I ran after the beauty of the things you have made. You were with me, and I was not with you. The things you have made kept me from you. The things which would have no being unless they existed in you. You have called, you have cried, and you have pierced my deafness. You have radiated forth. You have shined out brightly, and you have dispelled my blindness. You have sent forth your fragrance, and I have breathed it in, and I long for you. I have tasted you, and I hunger and thirst for you. You have touched me, and I ardently desire your peace. Amen.